One letter, 24 hours, and the end of an empire. September 1944, while the world watches Allied tanks roll toward Berlin. Nobody notices the envelope sitting on a Canadian general's desk. Inside, a career-ending ultimatum from the most powerful British commander in Europe. The message is clear. Apologize or you're finished. But here's what the British don't realize. They're not dealing with a colonial officer anymore. They're re-dealing with a man who's about to rewrite the rules of power in the middle of the biggest military campaign in history. What happens next takes 60 seconds. One response, one sentence. And suddenly, the British Empire realizes it no longer controls the board. This is the story of the moment Canada stopped playing by London's rules and started writing its own. To understand this clash, you need to understand the men. Bernard Law, Montgomery, Monty, the hero of Britain. After the humiliation of Dunkirk, after years of retreat and defeat, Music Montgomery had given the British people something they desperately needed: victory. At El Alamein, in 1942, he shattered Rommel's Africa cause. He made the impossible look inevitable. But Montgomery wasn't just a brilliant tactician. He was ruthless, arrogant, and obsessed with control. He demanded absolute obedience from his subordinates. In his mind, the chain of command was sacred. Question him, challenge him. That was career-ending. Now look across the tent at Harry Krah, the Canadian. Krah wasn't flashy. He wasn't a media darling, but he was methodical, calculating, and fiercely proud of his nation. He commanded the 1st Canadian Army, over 175,000 men, the largest formation Canada had ever fielded in its history. Here's what most people don't understand. The Canadian Army in 1944 wasn't some colonial militia taking orders from London. These were battle-hardened veterans who had fought their way up the Italian boot, who had stormed Juno Beach Music on D-Day, who had liberated French towns while suffering catastrophic casualties. The Canadians had earned their place at the table. But in Montgomery's eyes, they were still just another piece on his chessboard. September 1944, the Allied advance is slowing. Logistics are stretched to the breaking point. Every decision matters. Montgomery calls a critical staff meeting. All army commanders must attend. No exceptions. Then Krah does the unthinkable. He doesn't show up. Instead, he travels to the beaches of Dieppe. Let me explain what Dieppe means. August 19, 1942, the Canadian 2nd Division launches a raid on this fortified French port. The plan: test German defenses, gather intelligence, boost Allied morale. The reality: music, an absolute nightmare. Within hours, nearly 1,000 Canadian soldiers are dead. Another 2,000 are captured. The beaches run red. DEAP haunted Canada. It haunted Krah, and in September 1944, on the second anniversary of that tragedy, Krah makes a choice. He will honor those men. He will stand on those beaches and remember the fallen, even if it means defying Montgomery. When word reaches Montgomery's headquarters, the reaction is volcanic. The field marshal sees this as nothing less than mutiny. In the middle of a campaign with German forces still fighting desperately, Krah has abandoned his post for a ceremony. Unacceptable. Intolerable. Montgomery drafts a letter. The language is ice-cold and final. Krah will be relieved of command and sent back to England. His career is over. But Montgomery makes one critical miscalculation. He assumes Krah will fold. He assumes the Canadian general will plead, apologize, promise never to disobey again. He's wrong. When Korea receives Montgomery's ultimatum, there's no panic, no scrambling for excuses. Instead, Krah sits down and writes a response that will echo through history. Here's what he says, and I'm paraphrasing the essence of his message. You want to fire me? Go ahead, but understand this. I don't serve at your pleasure. I serve the Canadian government. And if you relieve me of command, you'll have to explain to Ottawa why you're redismissing their general in the middle of a campaign. Read that again. Explain to Ottawa. This is what historians call the Ottawa card, and it's a masterstroke of political warfare. CRA is reminding Montgomery of something the Field Marshal has conveniently forgotten. Canada is not a British colony anymore. The Canadian Army is funded by Canadian taxpayers, raised by the Canadian government, and answerable to Canadian political leadership. Montgomery commands the 21st Army Group, yes, but he doesn't command Canada. This isn't 1914 when Canadian divisions were essentially extensions of the British Army. This isn't even 1939 when Canada's entry into the war was still shadowed by imperial obligations. By 1944, Canada has its own foreign policy, its own declaration of war, and its own sovereign command structure. If Montgomery fires CRA, it becomes an international incident. Picture the headlines. British Field Marshal dismisses Canadian commander for honouring war dead. Imagine the outcry in Ottawa, in Parliament, across Canada. Winston Churchill would have to answer questions. King George would be dragged into the mess. The fragile unity of the Allied coalition, already strained by American-British tensions, could fracture. Montgomery realizes he's walked into a trap of his own making. Montgomery backs down, quietly, reluctantly, but he backs down. There's no public apology, no dramatic reconciliation. The incident is buried in official correspondence, tucked away in classified files. But everyone in the Allied High Command gets the message. The Canadians will not be pushed around. This moment ripples outward in ways that are hard to quantify, but impossible to ignore. For the Canadian soldiers fighting in Europe, there's a surge of pride. Their generals stood up to the British legend and won. That means something when you're slogging through mud and artillery fire. For Canadian political leaders back in Ottawa, it's validation. For decades, they've been building Canada's international identity, asserting independence while maintaining Commonwealth ties. Korea's stand proves that independence is real. And for the British, it's a wake-up call. The Empire is changing. The Dominions aren't children anymore. Within months, Canadian forces will liberate the Netherlands, suffering heavy casualties in brutal fighting. They'll be celebrated as heroes, not British soldiers on loan, but Canadians, sovereign, independent. When the war ends in 1945, Canada doesn't ride Britain's coattails at the peace conferences. Canadian diplomats sit at the table as equals, helping to build the United Nations, the NATO alliance, the post-war international order. The line from CRA's letter to Canada's emergence as a middle power runs straight and true. So why does this story matter today? Because it captures a universal truth. Respect music isn't given, it's taken. CRA could have apologized. He could have played the beautiful subordinate, absorbed the humiliation, and kept his career intact. Instead, he risked everything to defend his principles and his nation's dignity. And here's the kicker. Montgomery music probably expected Carrot to fold because that's what colonial subordinates did. For centuries, British officers had commanded Dominion forces as extensions of imperial power. But by 1944, the world had changed. CRA understood that music Montgomery didn't, at least not until that letter landed on his desk. This wasn't just about one missed meeting or one ceremony at Dieppe. It was about whether Canada would continue to accept a subordinate role in international affairs, or whether it would demand to be treated as a sovereign equal. CRA chose sovereignty, and in doing so, he set a precedent that would define Canada's role on the world stage for generations. The next time you think about Canadian military history, Don't just think about Vimy Ridge or Juno Beach. Think about that command tent in September 1944. Think about the moment when a Canadian general looked the British Empire in the eye and said, "Oh no, not anymore." That's the moment Canada stopped being a dominion and started being a nation.